Around 3,200 years ago, the world was more connected than most people think. A vast network of civilizations stretched across Eastern Mediterranean from Greece to Egypt, from Turkey to Syria, from Cyprus to the coasts of the Levant. These weren't primitive societies. They were sophisticated empires and city-states with complex economies, international diplomacy, writing systems, standing armies, and trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. They were, by any reasonable measure, the most advanced human societies the world had ever seen. And then within the span of roughly 50 years, between around 1200 and 1150 BC, almost all of them collapsed. Not one, not two, all of them simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, the Kingdom of Ugarit, the Canaanite city-states, Cyprus, major Eastern Egyptian territories, cities burned, writing systems vanished, trade networks disintegrated, populations scattered, and then silence, a dark age that lasted for centuries. We still don't know fully what happened, and this is the story of the civilization that disappeared and the letter that was never answered. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1550 to 1200 BC, was an era of extraordinary sophistication and interconnection. The Mycenaean Greeks built enormous palaces, complex, and maintained detailed administrative records in a script called Linear B. They traded with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. The Hittite Empire dominated what is now Turkey, a military and diplomatic superpower that had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, the earliest recorded peace treaty in history around 1259 BC. Ugarit, a port city on the coast of modern Syria, was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world at the time. Archaeologists had found documents written in 8 different languages at the site. These civilizations were not merely neighbors, they were deeply interdependent. Bronze, the defining metal of age used for weapons, tools, and trades, required both copper and tin. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. Tin came from the sources as far away as Afghanistan. No single civilization had both. They meant every Bronze Age society depended on international trade to function. Cut the supply chains and the armies couldn't be armed. Farmers couldn't use metal tools, economies collapsed. It was a deeply interconnected world, which meant it was also a deeply fragile one. In the ruins of the Ugarit, a city that was destroyed around 1185 BC and never reoccupied, archaeologists made a discovery that stopped them cold. They found letters, clay tablets inscribed with desperate pleas for help written in the final days of the city. One letter from the king of Ugarit to the neighboring ruler reads, "My father, the enemy ships are coming. The cities are burning. My armies are gone." The letter was never sent. It was found still in the kiln, waiting to be fired before dispatch. The city burned before the letter could leave. In another part of the site, archaeologists found correspondence between Ugarit and neighboring kingdoms, a chain of increasingly desperate messages as the situation deteriorated. Officials in Ugarit wrote that they had sent their army and their naval fleet to assist allied kingdoms. Their own coast was now undefended. They were begging for grain. Famine had struck. Enemy ships had been spotted. Hoards of gold, silver, and bronze were found buried throughout the ruins, hidden by residents who expected to return and collect them. They never came back. The city of Ugarit was burned to the ground. The rubble in places was 2 meters deep, and it was never rebuilt, never reoccupied. It simply ended. The Hittite Empire is perhaps the most dramatic case. At its height, the Hittite Empire controlled most of modern Turkey and extended into Syria. It had fought Egypt to a draw. It was one of the great superpowers of the ancient world. Around 1180 BC, its capital city, Hattusa, was burned to the ground and abandoned. No gradual decline, no long period of weakening. The city was functioning, and then it wasn't. What is remarkable is that the Hittites essentially vanished from history for nearly 3,000 years. They were remembered only in the Bible, which refers to the people called Hittites, but for centuries, modern historians assume it was a minor tribal group, perhaps fictional. It was only in the 19th century where archaeologists began excavating in Turkey that they discovered the ruins of Hattusa and realized that the Hittites had been one of the dominant civilizations of the ancient world. An empire with hundreds of thousands of people, treaties with Egypt, records in multiple languages, gone, forgotten, erased so completely that we didn't know they existed until 150 years ago. When writing disappeared in the collapse, so did memory. No writing means no records. No records means no history. The Hittites didn't just lose their civilization, they lost their existence in the human history until archaeology gave it back. So what happened? Historians and archaeologists have been debating this over a century and there is still no consensus on a single cause. What there is a growing body of evidence pointing to something even more disturbing than a single catastrophe. What appears to have happened is a perfect storm. Multiple crises happening simultaneously in a system too tightly interconnected to absorb even one of them, let alone all of them at once. Climate change and drought. Sediment, cores, and tree ring data from the region show a significant and prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BC. Crops failed, famine spread. Egyptian records from the reign of Pharaoh Menaphtah, who ruled around 1213 to 1203 BC, describe sending grains to the Hittites, suggesting the bread breakfast of Antonolia could no longer feed itself. Earthquakes, archaeological destruction layers at multiple sites show evidence of severe seismic activity at roughly this time. What historian Eric Klein has called an earthquake storm, cities already weakened by drought were physically damaged. The Sea Peoples. Egyptian records describe waves of maritime raiders attacking coastal cities across the Mediterranean. Who exactly these people were remains unknown. Possibly displaced population from collapsed regions seeking new homes, creating a cascade of destruction as they moved. Trade network collapse. When even one link in the interconnected Bronze Age trading system broke, whether through drought, invasion, or political collapse, it put strain on every other link. Civilizations that depended on each other for tin, copper, grain, and timber found their supply chains severed. Bronze production stopped, armies couldn't get equipped, economies failed. Each of these alone might have been survivable. Civilizations had endured droughts before, earthquakes before, invasions before, but all of them simultaneously in a system built on the assumption that the supply chains would hold. That was something no Bronze Age civilization was built to survive. When the Bronze Age collapsed, had run its course and the world remained was almost unrecognizable, the Mycenaean palace system with its linear B writing, its bureaucratic complexity, its trade networks, was gone entirely. Linear B disappeared. Greece would not have a written language again for centuries. In Anatolia, the Hittites were gone. In Syria, Ugarit was ash. Along the Levantine coast, city after city had been abandoned or destroyed. Population levels in affected regions dropped dramatically. In some parts of Greece, estimates suggest the population fell by as much as 75% over the century following the collapse. The Mediterranean entered what historians call a dark age. Not dark in the sense of evil, dark in the sense of unknown. The records stopped, the writing stopped, the trade stopped. We can see the world before the collapse in a remarkable detail, in the diplomatic letters, in the trade records and palace inventories. And then for centuries we can see almost nothing. It would take roughly 300 years before anything resembling the complexity of the Bronze Age began to reemerge. 300 years of human history in one of the most historical rich regions on Earth, largely invisible to us. Because when the writing disappeared, so did the story. The late Bronze Age collapse is not widely taught. It does not have the cultural weight of the fall of Rome or world wars. And yet it may be the most complete civilizational collapse in recorded history. Multiple advanced societies simultaneously gone. What replaced them? Slowly, over centuries became the ancient world we do know. classical Greece, the Phoenicians, the Syrian Empire, the war that eventually produced Rome and Islam and the modern West. All of it built on the ruins of something that came before, something more connected, more sophisticated, and ultimately more fragile than its inhabitants ever knew. Somewhere in the museum in Paris, that clay tablet from the Ugarit sits in a display case. The letter that was never sent, the plea that was never answered, baked into the permanence by fire that ended everything. The enemy ships are approaching, the cities are burning, my armies are gone. There are more stories like this one, buried on the ground, waiting to be found. That is what this channel is for. See you on the next one.